78 years ago, Lieutenant William Carter kissed his young wife Martha goodbye and walked toward his Navy bomber, unaware he would never return from the Pacific skies. His disappearance after a reconnaissance mission over the Solomon Islands in 1943 plunged the Carter family into decades of agonizing uncertainty and left a small Iowa farming community questioning what happened to their golden boy who dreamed of flying since childhood. Before continuing, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. The morning of October 12, 1943, dawned gray and threatening over Guadalcanal airfield. Lieutenant William Carter, call sign Eagle 7, had already completed 14 successful reconnaissance missions since arriving in the Pacific Theater 6 months earlier. At 26, he was considered one of the squadron's most reliable pilots, methodical, careful, never taking unnecessary risks that could endanger his crew or compromise the mission. Martha Carter had received his last letter just 3 days before the mission. In it, William wrote about the approaching monsoon season and how the tropical storms made flying increasingly dangerous. "The weather here changes faster than Iowa corn grows," he had written in his characteristic gentle humor. "But don't worry about me, sweetheart. I've got the best crew in the Pacific and we take care of each other." The reconnaissance mission was considered routine by Pacific Theater standards. Carter and his 3-man crew were tasked with photographing Japanese positions across several small islands in the Solomon chain. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy air activity in the region, making it what squadron commanders called a milk run, dangerous only due to weather conditions and the vast expanse of open ocean. Lieutenant James Morrison, Carter's wingman and closest friend in the squadron, later testified that the weather briefing that morning had been concerning. "The meteorology officer warned us about a tropical storm system moving in from the northeast," Morrison recalled in his official report. "But headquarters needed those reconnaissance photos before the storm hit. Command decided we had a 4-hour window to complete the mission and return." Carter's crew consisted of Navigator Lieutenant Robert Hayes, Radioman Petty Officer 3rd Class David Klein, and Rear Gunner Seaman 1st Class Thomas Wu. All 4 men had flown together for 3 months, developing the kind of trust and communication that kept bomber crews alive in the hostile Pacific environment. Their aircraft, a Douglas SBD Dauntless, designated Sweet Martha, after Carter's wife, had never failed to bring them home. The takeoff proceeded normally at 7:30 hours. Carter's voice crackled clearly over the radio as the formation of 4 bombers climbed toward their cruising altitude. Morrison later described Carter as sounding confident and relaxed during the initial radio checks. "He was talking about the weather clearing up ahead," Morrison remembered. "William always tried to find something positive, even when conditions looked rough." For the first hour of the mission, radio contact remained strong. Carter reported normal engine performance, clear visibility, and no sign of enemy aircraft. The formation photographed their first 2 target areas without incident, documenting Japanese coastal fortifications and supply positions that would prove valuable for future Allied operations. At approximately 8:45 hours, the first signs of the approaching storm became visible on the horizon. Dark clouds towered like mountains in the distance, and the wind began buffeting the aircraft more severely. Carter radioed that his crew was securing equipment in preparation for rough weather, following standard procedures for storm encounters. The last confirmed radio transmission from Sweet Martha came at 09:03 hours. Carter's voice, slightly distorted by increasing atmospheric interference, reported, "Eagle 7 to base entering weather system now, visibility dropping, winds increasing, maintaining formation with Eagle flight." What happened next became one of the Pacific Theater's most haunting mysteries. Morrison and the other 2 aircraft in the formation encountered severe turbulence and driving rain as they entered the storm system. Radio communication became impossible due to atmospheric interference, and visibility dropped to near zero. Following emergency procedures, each pilot focused on keeping his aircraft level and operational while riding out the storm. When the formation emerged from the weather system 45 minutes later, Sweet Martha was nowhere to be seen. Morrison immediately began radio calls, hoping Carter had been blown off course, but was still airborne. The vast Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no clues about where their squadron mate might have gone. The search began immediately upon the formation's return to Guadalcanal. Despite worsening weather conditions, every available aircraft was launched to scour the ocean for signs of Carter and his crew. For 3 days, searchers flew grid patterns over hundreds of square miles of Pacific water, looking for debris, oil slicks, or any trace of the missing bomber. The official telegram arrived at the Carter family farm in Iowa on October 18, 1943. Martha Carter, 6 months pregnant with their first child, collapsed when she read the words, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant William James Carter, is missing in action in the performance of his duty in the service of his country." The telegram that arrived at the Carter family farm in October 1943 contained just 42 words, but those words would define the next 78 years of their lives. Martha Carter, 24 and pregnant, found herself suspended between widowhood and hope, while her unborn son would grow up knowing his father only through photographs and the stories of strangers who had flown with him over the Pacific. The official status of missing in action carried a cruel ambiguity that prevented true mourning. Unlike families who received definitive news of their loved ones' deaths, the Carters lived in a liminal space where grief couldn't fully begin because hope refused to die. Martha would spend decades checking the mail, scanning newspaper reports of Pacific discoveries, and jumping at every unexpected knock on the door. William Carter Jr. was born in April 1944, 6 months after his father disappeared. Martha often said the baby had his father's eyes, the same bright blue that had captivated her at a county dance in 1940. But those eyes would never see the man who had written excited letters about becoming a father, describing plans to teach his son about flying, and showing him the Iowa cornfields from above. The war ended in 1945, bringing joy to most American families, but only deeper uncertainty to the Carters. Thousands of servicemen returned home to parades and celebrations, while Martha stood at the train station in Des Moines, scanning every face for one that would never appear. The government's casualty lists grew longer, but William's name remained in the agonizing category of missing presumed dead. Martha's sister Eleanor moved to the farm to help raise young William Jr., witnessing firsthand how the uncertainty consumed her sister. Martha never remarried, Eleanor recalled in 1995. She said she couldn't commit to another man, while William might still be alive somewhere. She wore her wedding ring until the day she died, and she kept his photograph on the nightstand, talking to it every morning like he might answer back. The Carter farm became a shrine to a missing man. William Sr.'s military portraits hung in the living room, his letters were preserved in a cedar chest, and his childhood bedroom remained exactly as he had left it when he enlisted in 1942. Martha refused to change anything, insisting that William would want everything familiar when he finally came home. Young William Jr. grew up surrounded by the ghost of a father he had never known. Neighbors and family friends told him stories about his father's kindness, his love of flying, and his determination to serve his country. But these second-hand memories couldn't fill the void left by a man who existed more as legend than parent. The boy developed an obsession with aviation that both comforted and worried his mother. By age 10, he could identify every aircraft type his father had flown and recite details about Pacific theater operations that most adults had forgotten. He built model planes obsessively, always focusing on the Douglas SBD Dauntless, the type of aircraft that had carried his father into the storm. School was difficult for William Jr., not because of academic challenges, but because of the constant questions about his father. Teacher conferences became painful ordeals where Martha had to explain repeatedly that her husband wasn't dead, wasn't alive, but was simply gone. The ambiguity confused classmates and teachers alike, making young William an object of curiosity and sometimes pity. The 1950s brought occasional false hopes that devastated the family anew. Reports of American prisoners in Japanese camps, discoveries of aircraft wreckage in remote Pacific locations, and stories of amnesia victims in military hospitals all triggered desperate investigations. Martha spent her modest widow's pension on long-distance telephone calls, following every lead that might bring William home. One particularly cruel episode occurred in 1953, when a man claiming to be William Carter appeared at the farm. He had enough biographical details to convince Martha initially, but family members quickly realized he was a disturbed veteran seeking to exploit their grief. The incident left Martha more cautious, but no less hopeful about her husband's eventual return. William Jr. joined the Air Force in 1962, driven by a need to understand his father's world and perhaps find answers in the skies over Southeast Asia. His deployment to Vietnam brought new anxieties for Martha, who now faced the possibility of losing her son to the same kind of uncertain fate that had claimed her husband. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the family. The boy was following his father's path into danger, seeking a man who might no longer exist. The decades passed with agonizing slowness. Martha aged from a vibrant young woman into a gray-haired widow, still waiting for news that never came. She died in 1987 at age 68, having spent more of her life waiting for William than she had spent living with him. Her final words, according to Eleanor, were, "Tell William I waited for him." William Jr., now a retired Air Force colonel, inherited both the farm and his mother's obsession with finding his father. He had spent his military career requesting assignments in the Pacific, hoping to stumble across some clue about the missing bomber. After retirement, he devoted himself to researching his father's case, contacting military historians, oceanographers, and anyone who might help solve the 70-year-old mystery. The Pacific Ocean kept its secrets for nearly 8 decades, its depths hiding the truth about Lieutenant William Carter and his crew beneath miles of dark water. While the Carter family aged and grieved above, the wreckage of Sweet Martha rested silently on the seafloor, slowly being claimed by coral and sediment, waiting for technology to advance enough to find what had been lost in the storm of October 1943. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know how far and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. The Solomon Islands region where Carter disappeared is one of the Pacific's most challenging underwater environments. Ocean depths in the area range from a few hundred feet near coral reefs to over 15,000 feet in the deeper channels between islands. The seafloor is a maze of underwater mountains, deep trenches and coral formations that can hide aircraft wreckage for generations. During World War II, this section of the Pacific became known as Iron Bottom Sound due to the numerous ships and aircraft lost in naval battles. The ocean floor was littered with the remains of American, Japanese, and Allied vessels, creating an underwater graveyard that would challenge salvage operations for decades to come. Finding one specific aircraft in this maritime cemetery seemed virtually impossible. Lieutenant Colonel William Carter Jr., now in his 70s, had never given up searching for answers about his father's fate. After retiring from the Air Force in 1995, he dedicated his time and resources to researching Pacific War disappearances. He contacted maritime archaeologists, studied ocean current patterns and analyzed weather reports from October 1943, trying to narrow down where his father's aircraft might have gone down. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist studying coral reef systems in the Solomon Islands, had been using advanced sonar mapping technology to document underwater ecological changes. Her research vessel, equipped with side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles, was systematically mapping the seafloor when her instruments detected an anomalous metallic signature. On March 15, 2021, Dr. Chen's team was conducting routine surveys approximately 47 nautical miles northwest of Guadalcanal when their sonar painted a distinctive image on the screen. The object appeared man-made, roughly 60 feet in length, and partially buried in sediment at a depth of 2,847 feet. The shape and size were consistent with a World War II-era aircraft. Dr. Chen immediately recognized the potential significance of the discovery. Her grandfather had served in the Pacific Theater, and she was familiar with the stories of missing airmen whose families never received closure. She contacted the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the military organization responsible for investigating and recovering American servicemen missing from past conflicts. The agency responded quickly to Dr. Chen's report. Within 2 weeks, a specialized recovery team arrived in the Solomon Islands with equipment designed for deep-water archaeological investigation. The team included maritime archaeologists, forensic specialists, and military historians who would work together to identify the wreckage and recover any human remains. The first remotely operated vehicle dive to the wreck site took place on April 2, 2021. As the ROV descended through the dark water, Its cameras revealed a ghostly scene that had remained undisturbed for nearly 80 years. The aircraft rested upright on the seafloor, its wings partially buried, but its fuselage relatively intact, despite decades of saltwater corrosion. Military aircraft identification experts immediately recognized the distinctive profile of a Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The aircraft's tail number, though partially obscured by marine growth, was still visible to investigators. When cleaned and photographed, the numbers matched records for Sweet Martha, Lieutenant William Carter's aircraft that had disappeared on October 12, 1943. The discovery sent shockwaves through the military history community and brought international media attention to the recovery operation. But for the Carter family, now represented by William Jr., and his grown children, the news was both a blessing and a curse. After 78 years of hoping their patriarch might somehow still be alive, they now faced the reality that he had died in 1943, just as military officials had always suspected. The recovery operation required careful planning and specialized equipment. Working at nearly 3,000 feet below the surface, investigators had to contend with strong currents, limited visibility, and the fragile nature of materials that had been submerged for decades. Every artifact had to be photographed, catalogued, and carefully preserved before being brought to the surface. Inside the aircraft's cockpit, investigators found personal effects that had somehow survived the decades underwater. A corroded wristwatch, fragments of flight equipment, and most poignantly, pieces of what appeared to be a leather wallet were recovered from the pilot's position. The wallet contained the remains of a photograph, too damaged to make out clearly, but family members believed it was the picture of Martha that William had carried on every mission. The most significant discovery came when investigators located human remains within the aircraft. Bone fragments were found in positions consistent with the pilot and crew positions, suggesting that the four men had gone down with their aircraft. After nearly 80 years of uncertainty, the physical evidence finally confirmed what the Carter family had feared but never been able to accept. Forensic analysis of the wreckage revealed that the aircraft had likely been caught in severe downdrafts during the tropical storm, forcing it into the ocean at high speed. The impact with the water had been catastrophic, explaining why no distress signals were received and why the aircraft had never been spotted during the search operations that followed its disappearance. The recovery of Sweet Martha from the Pacific depths triggered the most comprehensive investigation into a World War II disappearance in decades. The Defense POW-MIA accounting agency assembled a team of specialists who would spend months analyzing every piece of evidence recovered from the seafloor, determined to finally provide answers to questions that had haunted the Carter family for nearly 8 decades. The investigation faced unique challenges due to the extended time the wreckage had spent underwater. Saltwater corrosion had destroyed many materials, marine life had colonized the aircraft, and sediment had buried crucial evidence. However, advances in forensic science and underwater archaeology provided tools that hadn't existed when the search began in 1943. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the lead forensic anthropologist assigned to the case, had extensive experience with World War II recoveries. His laboratory at the Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command had processed remains from dozens of Pacific theater losses, but the Carter case presented unusual complexities. The extended submersion had affected the bone fragments in ways that made identification challenging. When human remains spend almost 80 years underwater, the degradation is extensive, Dr. Rodriguez explained to the Carter family during their first meeting. However, we have techniques now that can extract DNA from even heavily degraded samples. We also have comprehensive military dental records and medical files that can help with identification. The process of analyzing the recovered remains required months of careful laboratory work. Each bone fragment was photographed, measured, and subjected to chemical analysis to determine its origin and condition. DNA extraction from the degraded samples required multiple attempts using increasingly sophisticated techniques. Lieutenant Colonel William Carter Jr., now 77 years old, found himself in the surreal position of providing DNA samples to help identify his father's remains. The man who had spent his entire life searching for answers about his father's fate was now participating in the scientific process that would finally provide those answers. The aircraft wreckage itself told a compelling story about the final moments of the October 1943 mission. aviation archaeologists examined every component of the bomber, looking for clues about what had caused the crash. The engine showed no signs of mechanical failure, and the control surfaces appeared to have been functional when the aircraft hit the water. Weather analysis from 1943 confirmed that the tropical storm Carter's formation had encountered was one of the most severe of that year's monsoon season. Wind speeds had exceeded 80 miles per hour in the area where the aircraft was lost, with turbulence so severe that even modern aircraft would have struggled to maintain control. Computer modeling of the storm's path and intensity helped investigators understand how Sweet Martha had become separated from the rest of the formation. The aircraft had likely been caught in a powerful downdraft that forced it below the cloud cover, where disorientation in the storm conditions led to a high-speed impact with the ocean's surface. The personal effects recovered from the wreckage provided heartbreaking insights into the crew's final moments. Navigator Lieutenant Robert Hayes's flight charts were found secured in their waterproof case, suggesting the crew had been following proper procedures even as disaster struck. Radioman David Klein's logbook, though severely damaged, showed entries right up until the time the aircraft entered the storm system. One of the most significant discoveries was a fragment of metal from the aircraft's radio equipment that showed signs of battle damage. Upon closer examination, investigators determined this was not from enemy action, but from the severe turbulence that had battered the aircraft during the storm. The radio had likely been damaged or destroyed early in the encounter, explaining why no distress signals were ever received. The forensic team also analyzed the aircraft's impact pattern on the seafloor. The bomber had hit the water at a steep angle and high speed, indicating that the crew had likely lost control completely during the storm. The aircraft's position and the distribution of wreckage suggested it had plunged almost vertically into the ocean, giving the crew no time to attempt a water landing or abandon the aircraft. As the investigation progressed, a clearer picture emerged of the final mission. The four-man crew had performed their duties professionally right up until the moment disaster struck. Their aircraft had been properly maintained, their flight plan was appropriate for the mission, and their actions during the storm appeared to have followed training protocols. The tragedy wasn't the result of pilot error, mechanical failure, or enemy action. Instead, it was the consequence of the Pacific's notorious weather patterns and the inherent dangers of wartime aviation. The tropical storm that claimed Sweet Martha was simply too powerful for any aircraft of that era to survive, once caught in its most violent sections. DNA analysis of the bone fragments took several months to complete, but the results finally provided the scientific confirmation the Carter family had waited decades to receive. The remains recovered from the pilot's position were definitively identified as those of Lieutenant William James Carter, missing in action since October 12, 1943. Similar identifications were made for the other three crew members: Navigator Lieutenant Robert Hayes, Radioman Petty Officer 3rd Class David Klein, and Rear Gunner Seaman 1st Class Thomas Wu. All four men had gone down with their aircraft, ending nearly 80 years of uncertainty about their fate. The investigation's findings were compiled into a comprehensive report that would become part of the official military record. For the first time since 1943, the Carter family had definitive answers about what had happened to their patriarch. The mystery that had defined their lives for generations was finally solved. The scientific confirmation that Lieutenant William Carter's remains had been recovered from the Pacific floor sent shockwaves through the extended Carter family, but it also revealed deeper mysteries that had been buried for decades, along with the truth about his disappearance. As relatives gathered to plan the funeral that had been postponed for 78 years, long-hidden family secrets began to surface. Eleanor Carter Mitchell, Martha's sister, who had helped raise William Jr., was now 91, and the last living person who had known William Sr. personally. With the mystery finally solved, she felt compelled to share information she had kept secret since 1943, information that added new dimensions to the tragedy that had defined the Carter family. "There are things about your father that Martha made me promise never to tell," Eleanor confided to William Jr. during a family gathering following the official identification. "She thought it would be easier for you to grow up believing he was perfect. But now that we know what happened to him, I think you deserve to know who he really was." The revelation that emerged was both shocking and heartbreaking. In the months before his final mission, Lieutenant William Carter had been struggling with what would now be recognized as combat stress disorder. His letters to Martha, which the family had always treasured as expressions of love and optimism, had been carefully edited to hide his growing psychological distress. Eleanor revealed that she had received separate letters from William during his Pacific deployment, letters that painted a much darker picture of his mental state. He had witnessed horrific combat situations, lost close friends to enemy action, and was beginning to question his ability to continue flying missions. The cheerful aviator who had left Iowa in 1942 had been transformed by war into a troubled young man carrying psychological wounds that military medicine of the era couldn't treat. "He wrote to me because he didn't want Martha to worry," Eleanor explained. "He said he was having nightmares, that he couldn't sleep, that he kept seeing the faces of Japanese pilots he had shot down. He was afraid he was losing his mind, but he couldn't tell anyone in his squadron because they would have grounded him." The family also learned that William had requested a transfer to stateside duty just weeks before his final mission. His commanding officers had denied the request, citing his valuable experience and the critical need for veteran pilots in the Pacific theater. The mission that claimed his life had been assigned to him, despite his deteriorating mental condition. This information recontextualized the entire tragedy. William Carter hadn't died as the confident, capable pilot his family had always imagined. Instead, he had been a young man struggling with invisible wounds, fighting a war that was destroying him psychologically, even as he continued to perform his duties with professional competence. Dr. Patricia Williams, a military psychologist who specialized in World War II combat stress cases, reviewed the newly revealed letters at the family's request. Her analysis confirmed that William Carter had been exhibiting classic symptoms of what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that wasn't recognized or treated effectively during World War II. Lieutenant Carter's letters described symptoms that were tragically common among combat aviators, Dr. Williams explained. The military culture of that era discouraged admitting psychological distress, and men like Carter suffered in silence rather than seeking help that might have been available. The psychological profile that emerged from the letters also suggested that William's final mission might have been even more tragic than previously understood. His distressed mental state could have affected his decision-making during the storm encounter, potentially contributing to the aircraft's loss. However, aviation experts who reviewed the case emphasized that the storm conditions encountered by Carter's formation would have been challenging for any pilot, regardless of psychological state. The tropical storm that claimed Sweet Martha had been powerful enough to destroy aircraft flown by pilots in perfect mental health. William Jr. struggled to process this new information about his father. The heroic figure he had idealized throughout his life was revealed to be more human, more vulnerable, and ultimately more tragic than he had ever imagined. The discovery forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his father's war service. "I spent my whole life trying to live up to an image of my father that wasn't complete," William Jr. reflected. "Knowing that he was struggling, that he was human and flawed and hurting, somehow makes me respect him even more." He kept flying missions even when he was falling apart inside. The revelation also provided new context for Martha Carter's lifelong behavior. Her refusal to remarry, her preservation of William's belongings, and her persistent hope for his return could be understood as responses to a grief that was even more complex than the family had realized. She had been mourning not just a missing husband, but a man who had been emotionally lost even before he physically disappeared. Eleanor's decision to reveal these secrets so late in life was motivated by her belief that the family deserved to understand the complete truth about William's war experience. She had watched 3 generations of Carters struggle with an incomplete picture of their patriarch, and she wanted that burden to end with the recovery of his remains. The psychological dimension of William's story also highlighted the broader tragedy of World War II combat stress casualties. Thousands of servicemen had suffered psychological wounds that went unrecognized and untreated, leading to additional trauma for both the veterans and their families. The revelation of Lieutenant William Carter's psychological struggles transformed the family's understanding of their patriarch, but it also opened new wounds that had been sealed by decades of mythologizing. As they prepared for the funeral that should have taken place in 1943, the Carter family grappled with the complex reality of a war hero who had been quietly falling apart even before his final mission. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps the story of Lieutenant William Carter reach more people. William Carter Jr.'s adult children, Sarah, Michael, and David, found themselves confronting a grandfather they had never known existed. The family stories they had grown up with suddenly seemed incomplete, sanitized versions of a much more complex truth. Their grandfather hadn't been the unshakable war hero of family legend, but a young man struggling with invisible wounds in an era that offered little understanding or support. Sarah Carter Thompson, a clinical psychologist herself, was perhaps best equipped to understand the implications of her grandfather's mental health struggles. "Reading his actual letters was heartbreaking," she said. "You can see the progression of his symptoms, the way combat stress was eating away at him, but you can also see his determination to protect his family from knowing how much he was suffering." The family's research into William's military service revealed additional troubling details. His squadron had suffered heavy casualties during 1943, losing nearly 40% of its original pilots to combat and accidents. The psychological toll of watching friends die, combined with the constant stress of flying dangerous missions, had created an environment where mental health problems were inevitable, but rarely acknowledged. Lieutenant James Morrison, William's wingman who had survived the war, had died in 1987, but his family preserved letters and documents that provided additional insights into the squadron's mental state during the final months of 1943. Morrison's writings revealed that several pilots were struggling with what they called operational fatigue, the era's euphemism for combat stress disorder. "Jimmy wrote that some of the guys were getting the shakes," Morrison's daughter explained when contacted by the Carter family. "He mentioned that your grandfather seemed different in the weeks before the final mission. Jimmy was worried about him, but he didn't know what to do. Nobody did back then." The psychological context also explained some of Martha Carter's behavior that had puzzled family members for decades. Her insistence that William was still alive, her preservation of his belongings, and her resistance to accepting his death may have been unconsciously influenced by her knowledge of his deteriorating mental state when he left for his final mission. Eleanor revealed that Martha had received one of William's more disturbing letters, just days before news of his disappearance arrived. In it, he had written about feeling lost and wondering if he would ever find his way home. Martha had interpreted these words literally when William vanished, believing they meant he was physically lost somewhere in the Pacific, rather than psychologically lost in the trauma of war. The family's understanding of the tragedy deepened further when they learned about the military's handling of psychological casualties during World War II. Thousands of servicemen who suffered mental health crises were quietly transferred, discharged, or in some cases, court-martialed for what was then considered cowardice or lack of moral fiber. Dr. Robert Hayes, a military historian specializing in World War II aviation, explained that William Carter's case was tragically typical of the era. The military had no framework for understanding or treating combat stress, Dr. Hayes noted. Pilots who reported psychological problems were often grounded permanently, which meant the end of their military careers and significant social stigma. This context made William's continued flying even more poignant. He had been trapped between his deteriorating mental health and a military culture that offered no acceptable way to seek help. His final mission represented not just professional duty, but a young man's desperate attempt to maintain his identity as a capable pilot despite his inner turmoil. The family also discovered that William had been writing letters to his unborn child in the weeks before his disappearance. These letters, preserved by Eleanor for nearly 8 decades, revealed a father's hopes and fears about bringing a child into a world torn by war. They also showed his deep concern about whether he would survive to meet his son. "My dearest little one," one letter began, "I may never get to hold you or teach you to fly, but I want you to know that thinking about you keeps me going when everything else seems dark. Be good to your mother, and know that your daddy loves you even if he can't be there." Reading these letters was emotionally devastating for William Jr., who realized that his father had been acutely aware he might not survive the war. The cheerful optimism in his letters to Martha had been a protective facade, while his private writings revealed a man preparing for the possibility that he would never come home. The psychological dimension of William's story also highlighted the ripple effects of untreated combat trauma. His mental health struggles had indirectly affected 3 generations of his family, who had grown up with an incomplete understanding of both his sacrifice and his suffering. As the family prepared for William's long-delayed funeral, they faced difficult decisions about how to honor both his service and his struggle. The traditional narrative of heroic sacrifice seemed insufficient when weighed against the more complex reality of a young man who had given everything he had, including his mental health, to serve his country. The Carter family's experience reflected a broader reckoning with World War II's psychological casualties that was taking place across America. As the last generation of veterans passed away, families were finally able to discuss mental health struggles that had been hidden for decades due to stigma and misunderstanding. As preparations for Lieutenant William Carter's funeral moved forward in 2021, the Carter family discovered that their patriarch's story had touched lives far beyond their own. Veterans organizations, military historians, and families of other World War II missing servicemen reached out, sharing their own stories of loss and long-delayed closure. The case had become a symbol of both the price of war and the enduring power of hope. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency arranged for a full military funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, honoring not just William Carter, but the thousands of servicemen whose remains were never recovered from World War II battlefields. The ceremony would provide the closure that Martha Carter had died waiting for, and that her son had spent 78 years seeking. William Carter Jr., now facing his own mortality at age 77, found himself in the unique position of finally being able to mourn a father he had never known. The mixed emotions of grief, relief, and reconciliation created a complex psychological landscape as he prepared to bury a man who had been more myth than memory for most of his life. The funeral preparations also revealed how William Sr.'s disappearance had affected the broader community. The small Iowa town where he had grown up planned a memorial service to complement the Arlington ceremony. Local residents who were children during World War II shared memories of the young man who had dreamed of flying and had died pursuing that dream in service to his country. Margaret Wilson, now 94, had been William Carter's high school sweetheart before he met Martha. She attended the memorial planning meetings, sharing memories of a young man who had been fascinated by aviation from childhood. William used to lie in the cornfields watching airplanes fly over, she remembered. He said he was going to be a pilot someday, and we all thought he was crazy because farm boys from Iowa didn't become aviators. The community memorial also included remembrances from families of other local men who had served in World War II. William's story had become intertwined with the broader narrative of small-town sacrifice during America's greatest conflict. His disappearance had represented not just one family's loss, but an entire community's encounter with the devastating reach of global war. Dr. Sarah Chen, the marine biologist whose research had led to the discovery of Sweet Martha, attended the Arlington ceremony as a guest of the Carter family. Her scientific curiosity had unexpectedly provided closure to a decades-old mystery, demonstrating how advances in underwater technology were finally making it possible to solve cases that had been given up for lost. I never expected that studying coral reefs would lead to reuniting a family with their missing patriarch, Dr. Chen reflected. But that's the power of modern science and persistent searching. The ocean kept Lieutenant Carter's secret for almost 80 years, but technology finally made it possible to bring him home. The funeral ceremony at Arlington became a media event, drawing attention from military publications, veterans organizations, and families of other World War II missing servicemen. The story resonated with Americans who understood that thousands of families had endured similar decades of uncertainty about their missing relatives. Colonel Sarah Martinez, a military chaplain who conducted the service, emphasized the broader significance of William Carter's story. Lieutenant Carter represents not just one missing airman, but all the sons, fathers, and brothers who never came home from World War II, she said. His funeral honors their sacrifice and acknowledges the families who waited for news that never came. The ceremony included the presentation of a folded American flag to William Carter Jr., for finally providing the closure ritual that should have taken place in 1943. The symbolic transfer from one generation to the next marked the end of nearly 8 decades of uncertainty and the beginning of a new understanding of William Sr.'s legacy. Military honor guards performed the traditional rifle salute and flag-folding ceremony, while a bugler played taps over the casket containing the remains recovered from the Pacific floor. The sounds echoed across Arlington's rolling hills, where thousands of other American servicemen lay buried, finally welcoming home a comrade who had been lost at sea for 78 years. William Carter Jr.'s eulogy for his father was both deeply personal and broadly representative of the World War II generation's sacrifices. "My father gave everything to serve his country," he said. "He gave his youth, his mental health, his dreams of coming home to raise his son, and ultimately his life. But he also gave us the freedom to live in the America he died protecting." The eulogy also acknowledged the psychological dimensions of William Sr.'s service that had only recently come to light. "We now know that my father was struggling with wounds that weren't visible, fighting battles inside his mind even as he flew missions over the Pacific. His sacrifice was greater than we ever imagined because he kept serving even when that service was destroying him." Representatives from the Douglas Aircraft Company, which had manufactured the SBD Dauntless bomber, attended the ceremony to honor both the aircraft and the crew that had gone down together. The company's current leadership recognized that their World War II aircraft had carried thousands of young Americans into combat, and they wanted to honor those who had died flying their planes. The ceremony concluded with a flyover by modern Navy aircraft, honoring the Aviator, who had disappeared in 1943, and acknowledging the continued service of the military aviation community. The roar of jet engines over Arlington's quiet grounds provided a powerful reminder of how far aviation technology had advanced since William Carter's era. As family members gathered after the service, they reflected on how the long-delayed funeral had finally brought closure to a story that had defined their lives for generations. William Carter Jr. could finally stop searching for his father and begin processing the complex legacy of a man who had been both hero and victim of his era's brutal conflicts. The burial of Lieutenant William Carter at Arlington National Cemetery in 2021 marked the end of one story, but revealed the beginning of another. His case had become a catalyst for renewed attention to the thousands of World War II servicemen who remained missing, and his family's journey from uncertainty to closure inspired other families to continue their own searches for answers about their lost relatives. William Carter Jr. found himself transformed from a man searching for his father into an advocate for other families facing similar uncertainties. He began working with veterans organizations and the Defense POW's MIA accounting agency to support ongoing recovery efforts throughout the Pacific Theater. His lifelong obsession with finding his father evolved into a mission to help others find theirs. "I spent 78 years not knowing what happened to my father," William Jr. explained at a veterans conference. "I understand the pain of that uncertainty, and I want to help other families find the closure that we were fortunate enough to receive. No family should have to wait 8 decades for answers." The Carter case also highlighted the role of advancing technology in solving decades-old mysteries. Dr. Sarah Chen's work with underwater sonar systems demonstrated how marine research could accidentally solve military cases, leading to new collaborations between oceanographers and military recovery teams. The Defense POW MIA accounting agency began incorporating marine biology research vessels into their search strategies, recognizing that scientific expeditions were covering vast areas of the Pacific floor that had never been systematically searched for military remains. This collaboration opened new possibilities for discovering other aircraft and vessels lost during World War II. William Carter Jr.'s adult children found themselves inheriting not just their grandfather's legacy, but also their father's passion for helping other military families. Sarah Carter Thompson established a foundation that provided support for families of missing servicemen, while her brothers Michael and David began documenting other World War II disappearance cases that remained unsolved. The Foundation's work revealed the staggering scope of World War II losses that remained unresolved. More than 72,000 American servicemen were still listed as missing from the conflict, their families carrying the same burden of uncertainty that had defined the Carter family for 8 decades. Each case represented not just a missing soldier, sailor, or airman, but generations of relatives who had grown up without answers. Eleanor Carter Mitchell, now in her 90s, became an unexpected advocate for acknowledging the psychological casualties of World War II. Her revelations about William Carter's mental health struggles had opened conversations about combat stress that had been suppressed for decades. She began speaking at veterans events about the importance of recognizing invisible wounds and supporting families dealing with combat trauma. "We did a disservice to these men by pretending they were invulnerable," Eleanor told audiences. William and thousands like him suffered in silence because admitting psychological wounds was considered weakness. "We need to honor their complete sacrifice, including the mental health costs of their service." The broader implications of William Carter's story resonated throughout the military community. Current servicemen and women, many dealing with their own combat stress from recent conflicts, found inspiration in his story of continued service despite psychological struggles. Military mental health professionals used his case to illustrate the importance of seeking help and the dangers of suffering in silence. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, a modern Air Force pilot, wrote about William Carter's influence on her own career. "Reading about Lieutenant Carter's struggles and his determination to keep flying made me realize that asking for help isn't weakness. It's what allows us to continue serving effectively. His story probably saved my career and maybe my life." The Carter family's experience also influenced military policy regarding missing servicemen and family support. The decades of uncertainty they had endured highlighted gaps in how the military communicated with families and maintained search efforts over extended periods. Their case contributed to reforms in how missing servicemen cases were handled and how families were kept informed about ongoing recovery efforts. The town of Carter's birth in Iowa established a scholarship fund in his memory, supporting young people who wanted to pursue careers in aviation or military service. The scholarship recognized not just his sacrifice, but also the dreams of flight that had motivated him to enlist and serve in the Pacific Theater. High school students who received the William Carter Memorial Scholarship were required to research and present on a World War II topic, ensuring that new generations would understand the scope and cost of that conflict. Many chose to focus on missing servicemen, extending William's story into educational programs that reached thousands of young Americans. The case also inspired artistic and literary works that explored themes of loss, memory, and family trauma. Documentaries, books, and museum exhibits used William Carter's story to examine how war affected not just combatants, but the families who waited for them to return home. Professional historians began studying the Carter case as an example of how family mythology could both sustain and complicate the grieving process. The idealized version of William that Martha had created for their son had provided comfort, but had also prevented full understanding of his wartime experience and sacrifice. The recovery of sweet Martha from the Pacific floor became a symbol of persistence and hope for the broader military community. The aircraft's discovery after nearly 8 decades demonstrated that even the most seemingly hopeless cases could eventually be resolved through advances in technology and continued searching. Military museums began displaying artifacts recovered from the aircraft, using them to educate visitors about both the technology of World War II aviation and the human cost of combat operations. William Carter's flight helmet, recovered from the wreckage, became part of a traveling exhibit that honored all missing servicemen. 78 years after Lieutenant William Carter disappeared into a Pacific storm, his story reached its conclusion not with the dramatic rescue his family had always hoped for, but with the quiet dignity of scientific discovery and military honor. The young aviator who had left Iowa as a farm boy with dreams of flight was finally laid to rest among the heroes of Arlington National Cemetery, his service acknowledged and his sacrifice remembered. The Carter family's journey from uncertainty to closure became a testament to the enduring power of hope and the importance of never giving up on the missing. William Carter Jr., who had spent his entire life searching for his father, could finally stop looking backward and begin looking forward, secure in the knowledge that his father's story was complete. "I used to dream about my father walking through the front door," William Jr. reflected at the conclusion of the burial ceremony. "I imagined him explaining where he had been all these years, why he couldn't come home sooner. Now I understand that he tried to come home. He just couldn't make it through the storm." The broader implications of William Carter's story continued to resonate throughout American society. His case demonstrated how advances in technology could solve mysteries that seemed impossible to resolve, providing hope for other families still waiting for answers about their missing relatives. The collaboration between marine researchers and military recovery teams that led to his discovery became a model for future search operations. Dr. Sarah Chen, whose coral reef research had accidentally solved the 8-decade mystery, continued her work in the Pacific with renewed awareness of the historical significance of the ocean floor. Her discovery of Sweet Martha had transformed her understanding of her role as a marine scientist and her responsibility to the families of missing servicemen. Every time I deploy underwater equipment now, I think about the families who might be waiting for news, Dr. Chen explained. Science has the power to heal old wounds and provide closure that seemed impossible. That's a responsibility I take very seriously. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency incorporated lessons learned from the Carter case into their ongoing recovery operations. The successful identification and repatriation of William Carter and his crew provided a template for handling other complex underwater recoveries throughout the Pacific theater. Eleanor Carter Mitchell, the last living link to William Carter's pre-war life, found peace in knowing that the family secret she had carried for decades had finally been shared and understood. Her decision to reveal William's psychological struggles had enriched the family's understanding of his sacrifice and contributed to broader conversations about combat trauma. Keeping those secrets was the hardest thing I ever did, Eleanor said. But William made me promise to protect Martha and their son from knowing how much he was suffering. Now that everyone knows the truth, I feel like I can finally let him rest in peace. The William Carter Memorial Scholarship continued to support young aviators and military personnel, ensuring that his legacy would inspire new generations of Americans to serve their country. Recipients of the scholarship learned not just about William's heroism, but also about the psychological costs of combat and the importance of seeking help when struggling with invisible wounds. The case also influenced military mental health policies, contributing to reforms that made it easier for current servicemen and women to acknowledge psychological struggles and seek treatment. William Carter's story of suffering in silence became a cautionary tale that helped break down stigmas surrounding combat stress and mental health support. Museums and educational institutions incorporated William Carter's story into their World War II exhibits, using his experience to illustrate both the technological aspects of Pacific theater aviation and the human dimensions of military service. His recovered flight equipment became artifacts that connected modern audiences with the realities of 1940s combat operations. The town where William Carter grew up planned a permanent memorial that would honor not just him, but all the local men who had served and died in World War II. The memorial would include information about the psychological challenges faced by combat veterans, acknowledging aspects of military service that had been largely ignored for decades. William Carter Jr., his children and grandchildren found themselves inheritors of a more complete family history than previous generations had possessed. They understood their grandfather not just as a heroic figure, but as a complex young man who had given everything he had to serve his country, including his mental health and ultimately his life. The recovery vessel that had discovered Sweet Martha continued its work in the Pacific, searching for other missing aircraft and vessels from World War II. Dr. Chen's team had developed expertise in identifying and recovering underwater military sites, making them valuable partners in ongoing efforts to bring missing servicemen home. As the story of Lieutenant William Carter reached its conclusion, it became clear that his legacy extended far beyond his individual sacrifice. His case had demonstrated the persistence of family love, the power of advancing technology, and the importance of acknowledging the complete cost of military service. The young man who had dreamed of flying over Iowa cornfields had died in service to his country, but his story had ultimately served to heal wounds, inspire others, and contribute to a more complete understanding of World War II's human cost. His final mission, interrupted by a Pacific storm in 1943, was completed 78 years later when he finally came home. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Lieutenant William Carter's story. See you in the next video.